Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming out, and it's such a pleasure to read with such great writers and to be a part of this community. This is actually my first Bay Area event, so I'm very glad to inaugurate it here with you. And just going to read a little from the end of the book. And a quick overview. I've trapped myself by writing a book that is impossible to describe in 2 or 3 sentences. Do not do this, writers, when you begin a book. You need to have a nice nugget. What it is, essentially, is a novel with 2 intersecting storylines, one of which is set in the present day Chicago and the other in turn-of-the-century Chicago. And in the present day, the protagonist is a guy named Adam Clary, who is working for a massive tech firm that is digitizing the world's books, attempting to digitize the world's books. If this sounds familiar to you, he's working out of the Chicago office. A lot of this digitizing was done in huge Midwestern universities, and so he is one of the leading people in doing that digitization project in the Midwest. And he despises his job and wants to be, more than anything else, a writer at a time when the physical book and book culture have never been more threatened. And so half of the book is his story and how he is dealing with that conflict, with that contradiction. And the other half is, in essence, a retelling or a sequel, in many ways, to Sherwood Anderson's classic Winesburg, Ohio. Those of you who have read that book, who know that book, and maybe love that book as much as I love that book, know that at the end of that story cycle, novel and stories book, the main recurring character, George Willard, an 18-year-old newspaper person, the town reporter, is standing at the railway station in Winesburg, Ohio, and he's going to catch a train heading west. We know that that's going to be Chicago, but we don't know what happened to George Willard when he got to Chicago. So that's what the historical half of my book is. George Willard's arrival in Chicago. And the only other thing I'll say, because I'm going to read the beginning of George Willard's, my imagining of George Willard's Chicago. The only other thing I would mention is that one of the central tensions, contradictions going on in the book is this desire that the central characters have to be artists while faced with the reality of commerce and the reality of making a living. And so I guess that's my contribution to contradiction. And I'll just read a little from the beginning of the historical part of this novel. The only other thing I will say, and this is the last thing I will say, is that at the time that I wrote this novel, I had not watched Mad Men. I had never seen an episode of Mad Men. But I was always interested in the history of advertising. Because I had young kids, honestly, the last movie I saw in a theater was Ratatouille. So that will give you a sense of just how with it in the culture I am and have been. I have finally caught up on Mad Men now, and I'm watching it sort of each Sunday. But at the time I wrote the book, no Mad Men. But you'll see what I'm talking about as I read this. 8 years ago, George Willard came to Chicago green as a sprout. And now, to his surprise, he had risen to near the top of the city's leading ad agency. His campaigns had reached households across the land, and his large windowed office on the 14th floor of the Monadnock building looked down on the workers and vendors, horses and drays, omnibuses and cable cars crisscrossing the loop. This would have been around 1907. At 27, he made a higher salary than his father had ever dreamed of, and were he to return to his hometown of Winesburg, Ohio, he could buy one of the finest houses. But he knew there was no going back. He had made a promise to his mother before she died that he would leave for the city and not follow the path of his father, who even now was patching the walls of the gloomy family inn and promising that the new Willard house, that husked by the tracks in a dying town, would one day be filled with guests again. When he left Winesburg in spring 1896, George had planned to find a newspaper job, and after that, to become a writer. But he'd arrived in the fastest growing city the world had ever known, only to find that this place of 1,000 tongues had one universal language: commerce. You could breathe it in the air, a devil's brew of sweat and rotting vegetables, pine and turpentine, and something deep and earthy like steam off a rendering pot. And you could see it at every corner: brokers gathered under lampposts discussing the price of wheat, seamstresses hunched over tables in basement windows, salvagers peddling iron from the backs of rickety wagons, newsboys shouting bulletins. George had wanted to write those bulletins, but an accident, an actual collision with fate, had made him a writer of a different sort, a persuader for profit, a copywriter. And though he wanted to believe that he was still a kind of artist, and his work had the same aim as a novelist or story writer's, to communicate one soul to another, he'd been growing restless, and was sometimes gripped with a worry that for all his outward success, he had lost his way. From his half-open door, he could hear the voice of his boss, Alfred Lazar, in conversation with the vaunted Clyde Kennison. They were talking, as they had been for months, about Kennison's new ideas. "You're the future of advertising," Lazar was saying now. "I want you to teach the whole firm your philosophy. From today until spring, that's your only assignment. We need scores of Clyde Kennisons here." George stood up from his swivel chair and closed the door, then sat again behind his polished cherry desk. He had no one to blame but himself for the arrival of Clyde Kennison. One June evening, 6 months ago, he had been in Lazar's office planning the next installment of his Tidy Town campaign. He'd made his reputation with Tidy Town, a mythical place where the citizens polished everything clean as pearls from floor to ceiling with Nuvolia soap. George had invented all the characters and written all the jingles, had helped make Nuvolia America's top-selling cleanser. But other brands were gaining. Nuvolia had dropped to third behind Ivory and Gold Dust, and though George did have one hidden advantage, a trump card he'd been reluctant to play, he knew he was falling out of favor at the agency. He remembered the day in his boss's office when a courier had knocked on the door and delivered a note. Lazar had grabbed it and read aloud. "Not a man in your firm knows the first thing about advertising. Not a man on this spinning earth knows either. But if you want to know, tell this courier to send me upstairs. I'm waiting in the lobby." "Would you believe the nerve?" Lazar had said. George had taken the note and read it himself. Even the bold handwriting had a mark of audacity. "But aren't you a little curious to meet this fellow?" he asked. "Oh, go ahead if you're so interested." Lazar commanded the courier to send the man up. Kennison introduced himself, and Lazar told him it was getting late. He had 5 minutes to make his case. More than a decade older than George, Kennison had keen, close-set eyes and a chevron mustache that barely concealed his supercilious mouth. He said he was a copywriter in Milwaukee who had led successful campaigns for Dr. Schutz's Restorative, Weetabix cereal, and the Royal Shoe Company. He'd once been ad manager for Hudson's Bay in Winnipeg, but his truly formative experience had come during his years as an officer of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, when he used to travel alone on horseback across the northern snows, thinking of advertising, day and night, meditating like some capitalist monk on how to reach the largest numbers of buyers. What he came up with was so simple that it could be summarized in one sentence, which he delivered at the end of those first 5 minutes. "Prove they need it." That single line had piqued Lazar's interest enough to ask Kennison to explain, and for the next 4 hours the Canadian paced and gesticulated and went over his concepts point by point. Ads should be unadorned, easy for the average person to grasp, and must avoid cleverness and art. Anything to distract from the argument that the product is essential and no reasonable human being should be without it. "Advertising is sales on the page," he said. Pretty pictures and rhymey jingles and silly made-up characters are useless because they make only the most general claims. George took umbrage. Perhaps you've heard of Tidy Town, he asked. But Kennison was unimpressed. The tidy farmer, the tidy grocer, the tidy maid in the lot? No offense, sport, but Tidy Town will soon fall off the map. George had bristled at this prophecy, but he should have been alarmed when Lazar failed to defend him and allowed the meeting to go on until close to midnight. George couldn't have known then what he was beginning to realize now, that advertising was changing, that the soft sell which had made his career thus far would soon be eclipsed by prove they need it, that the meeting George himself had made possible would go down in business history and launch the agency so far into the firmament that one day Alfred J. Lazar would become known as the father of modern advertising. That's it.